Begin the current Daf, Mesechtes Gitin Daf. Begin 3 lines down by the top of the oven, where the Gemara continues to explain the halacha of our previous Mishnah, which opened up this parak on the previous Daf, regarding the halacha of Nasim B'yada, that a person wants to divorce his wife, he has to write a set of creases, and he has to give it into our hand, and that's what the Mishnah was discussing, exactly what's considered putting it into our hand. It doesn't literally mean to say in her hand, it has to be in her possession. The question is, what's considered putting into possession? And the Gemara continues explaining one of the cases of our Mishnah. Shis corresponds to Kazakh and Cheskel, 10 to Daf Yomi. Appreciate joining today's Daf. So I'm discussing today's Daf, like we said, B'Nasan, where the husband may place the gets, Machlekes, whether Kelev Shalekeach, if the buyer has a vessel, B'Shus Meicher, in the possession of the seller, would he be kaina? Because it's his bowl, but it's in the owner's house, so you didn't really put it in, you didn't change really areas. And also on Kiped about where he would be makbid or would he not be makbid, then you would say that okay, even if it's in his rishus, but if he's not particular, then it would be considered the lekeach, or in our case, the woman's possession. The halacha that hagitech, that the husband has to tell his wife in the next Mishnah that here, this is your get. She has to know that it's that she's getting a get. The halacha of tli gitech, which is he tells her, hey, you take the get from the ground. Obviously, that wouldn't be valid because it has to be of a nosan. He has to do a ma'is nesina to her. Chatzim halacha is the halacha of, although a chatzar of her is considered an extension of her and it's her possession, it's putting in biyadoi, but it's mahaleches. If it's a walking chatzar, well, how's that possible? Because like the har eved is her chatzar, then that would not be possible. But there would be certain cases that would be possible, even though it's a moving person, to be able to acquire for her. The halacha of karav le karav la. What happens if he throws her the get? And it depends if it's closer to him, closer to her. The Gemara has a whole discussion. What does it mean closer? What's the measurements that defines that? The halacha of dalat amis, that a person's dalat amis is considered their area to acquire for them. And being increases, the halacha that it has to be a safer creases, which means there has to be total severance. If there's still some connection between the husband and his ex-wife, you're not fully divorced, and it would not be valid as a gitin. So we begin Daf Ayin Ches, 3 lines down at the top of the Yamad. We had said in the Mishnah that if he threw it to her in his house or in his courtyard, so the words of the Mishnah are, as our Gemara quotes, Afilahu ima b'mita, even if he's with her in the same bed, etc., in Megureshes, she's not going to be divorced. Because again, it's his possession. She wasn't put into her hand. The fact that it's on the bed, it's still, he's there, it's in the same house, so she's not divorced. Now, Amar Ravi qualifies, and he says, Lo shana el b'mita shaloi. We only learned this by his bed, a b'mita shalah, but in her bed, even though it's in his house, but the woman has her own bed, Megareshes, she's going to be divorced. Now, the Gemara assumes right now that the reason for this is because Kelev Shalekeach, this was her own bed. When you have your own vessel, your own bowl, your own plate, whatever this and that, B'Shus Meicher, in the possession of the seller, the buyer would be able to acquire that object that's placed into his vessel, which is machlekes and baba basta, pay him a base. So the Gemara assumes right now that that's what this halacha is based on, because it's her bed, even though it's his house. But put the get on her bed, she will be divorced. And Tana Macha, similar in the Brayser, Belaza, he says, "B'mita shaloi any mugarashes." Yeah, his bed, meaning even she's on the bed, but wasn't put in her hand. If it's his bed, she's not divorced. B'mita shaloi mugarashes. If it's her bed, again, not just her bed that he designates for, it's she owns the bed, then she's going to be divorced. Is that really so? With her bed, she's going to be divorced? But this is Kel Yoshalekeach. It's the vessel of the buyer, B'Shus Meicher, in the possession of the seller. It's in the husband. We're calling him the Meicher, so to speak. It's in his possession. And even if she brought this bed from her father's house she got it from her grandmother and she brought it to her husband, but she owns it. But Shamim, we should infer from this the halachic dispute in Baba Basra. Similarly, you see that when you have the vessel of the buyer in the possession of the seller, the buyer acquires, because here the woman, it's her bed, but it's in the husband's house. And still we see that it's going to be considered as going out of his domain into her domain. So you see, even though it's in his rishus, that you can be acquiring, like that mandamer. Says no, it's not necessarily a raya to that mandamer. We're talking about the Gevaya Asara. The bed is 10 tefachim high, where it creates its own area, and that airspace is not considered the airspace of the seller to nullify the domain of the vessel, because above 10 tefachim creates its own area. Says Gemara, okay, so it's in the airspace above, let's say, his ground of his house, but there's the place of the legs which are placed on the floor, and that's in the husband's possession, that's in his rishus. So says the Gemara, the place where legs are, people are not particular. Since the main bed is above 10 tefachim, where it's easy to use the area beneath it, so therefore, like Taisus is l'chol pachas regarding his wife, and regarding the airspace of the bed, he's not going to be particular, and therefore that's why it's going to be considered as a valid get, but it wouldn't be a raya. If, let's say, her bed was a low-down bed, the ones that go on the floor, could be that the halacha would be different, and she would not be able to acquire it, even though it was her own bed. We're only talking about because it's above 10 tefachim from the ground. Next halacha the Mishnah spoke about was, if he throws it, again, in his house, into her lap, or or into her basket, so megareshes, she's going to be divorced even though it's in the husband's house. Says Gemara, Amai, same question. Why is this the case? This seemingly, again, which is Tali and the Machlaikis, and seemingly should bring a raya then, that it's the vessel of the buyer in the possession of the seller. It's in his house. So you're in that guy's house, how are you acquiring as if you're going into your possession? Must be that if you have your own vessel in the seller's possession, you could acquire. So I'm going to read the Mishmul. The Gemara has a few different approaches to say why it's not a raya. We're talking about where her basket was hanging from her. Her basket was hanging from her body. So since it's hanging from her body, it's not considered as it's just like a person is not considered the possession of the seller. So to hear that it wouldn't bring a raya for the halacha of keliv shalikech b'shus meicher because it's hanging from her. He says, says actually it's enough just that it's tied to her, even though it's not suspended. Rather, it could be dragging on the ground. As long as it's tied to her, it's considered an extension of the woman. A woman herself, the person themselves, yes, could acquire. That wouldn't bring a right to just having a bowl or whatever it is, a bed, just laying there on the ground. That's one approach. Another approach of Adar Avam, he says, where the basket was laying between her legs. So even though it is on the ground, a person not particular on the area where his wife is sitting, where up until now, that area was always acquired to her. So it's not a halacha of this idea of kelya shalikech b'shus meicher. No. And Taisa actually asks this like an obviously, because her lap is literally like her hand. So Taisa has to explain exactly what the case is talking about, if like her garment is dragging on the ground or whatever it is. But the point is that a person won't be makbid about the area between her legs. B'chlal, a person would let a person be considered like it's your own area where you're sitting. And therefore, that's another approach why it's not just your classic kelya shalikech b'shus meicher. A third approach, he says, interesting answer. He says, for example, if the husband was a basket seller, so therefore, he's not particular about her place where she has her basket because he has a whole house designated for that. So therefore, that would be the same thing for her own basket. Therefore, it's not a concern over here if he wants to divorce her and she has a basket, like, okay, the whole house is full of baskets. And we don't care if there's a basket case over here. The fourth interpretation, he says, Mokum cheka kanula, the area of her lap is acquired to her. Mokum kalsa kanila, that the place of her basket is acquired to her, meaning that she's always entitled for this. And Amar Rava says, "My temper, what's the reason? What's he basing it on? That the area of her, that's exactly the question we're asking. How does that work?" So he says, "Lafisha no mak, but the person not particular lo mokum cheka, not in the area of her lap, lo mokum kalsa, not the area of her basket. It's pashut halachas of kapedas, and a person is not makbid, and therefore it's going to be considered her area." The Tanya Malchazon and the Brisa that because he's not particular, that's why, since he's not makbid, that gives it to her like he's almost like he's makna to other area. So it's not b'shus the moicher, it's literally b'shus the lekech. As the Brisa says that Zarku l'leteicheka, if he threw it to her in her lap, or l'teich kalsa, or into her basket, or l'teich kalda b'shuka kalas, or anything that's like her basket, meaning that's designated constantly for her utility, Harezu Megaresh is going to be divorced, where a person lets his wife come into his house on the condition that her utensils, these small items that she uses, will be with her, that she brings it in. Says the Gemara, so that's how Rashi was explaining what the raya was, that you see that a person not mocked, but anything that's like the basket, this is her own little, toiletries or whatever this that she uses, that's the space she gets to use. Now says the Gemara, anything that's like the basket, what's that coming to include? That's Lasuya Taska, that's coming to exclude like a sack, the Achla Batamri, that bag of snacks, that's also considered her domain, and that's the rights that the husband gives to his wife. So again, these cases were just not to prove the halacha of Keli Shalikeich B'Shus Meicha, that you could be kaina, could be not, as we had these different interpretations. With that, we continue with the next Mishnah, continuing on the same theme of the previous Mishnah regarding Benos and Biyada, regarding the halacha of giving it to the woman. So we spoke about before about really the element of Biyada, of like what's considered giving it to her. Now, what's the halacha of considered as giving it? So Amalah, if he tells her, Kinsi shtar chayvzeh, he tells her, here, I'm giving you this loan document. That's one case. Or she found it behind him. She reads it, she picks it up. Wait a second, but Gita, this is her get. So in these two cases, ain't a get. It's not going to be valid as a get. Until he tells her, this is your get. As Rashi says, even after it already came to her hand, if he says this, is enough. Because it's that as long as she, from Bishilcha, that she knows she's being sent away, that's okay. But you have to tell her, hagitech, that this is your get. In contrast, if he tells her, hey, this is a loan document, or if she just finds it and she reads it and she realizes the get, that's not enough. He has to tell her this. Continues the Mishnah. Nasan biyada biyushena. If, let's say, he puts it in her hand and she's sleeping. Ne'ara, she wakes up, kaira, she reads the morning paper, and when she's reading, she realizes about a gita, it's actually her get. Says the Mishnah in the get, again, it's not going to be a get, until he tells her, here, this is your get. So, and actually, Tosha brings from the read that he required, someone gives a get to his wife to say, hey, gitach, these are halachic obligations that you have to tell her. Says the Gemara, the following question. One of the cases was that if she finds it behind him, so he said that's not going to be valid because he didn't tell her hagitech. Says the Gemara, okay, but in the case of when she finds it behind him, and he tells her, hey, Shirley, this is your get. My haba, what's going to be? That's still not going to work. This is the halacha case of you take your get from the ground, because that's what happened. Even though he didn't tell her, she picked up from the ground, and she's reading it. And even if she sees, Moshe, good, and she sees that it's her get, and he says, yes, this is your get. So okay, you makayim that halacha, but v'amar Rabba, there's a different problem. If let's say he tells her, take your get from the ground, he hasn't said anything because you need to have v'nasan, you have to give it, she can't take it. So even if you're telling me this in this mission in the halachic category of regarding hagitech, that's still not enough because you're still missing in v'nasan. So the Gemara says, this that we said that she found it behind him, you know what it's talking about? Is that it was actually the get was stuck between his belt and his waist, and she pulled it out from behind him. When we say she found it behind him, it doesn't mean behind him on the floor. She sees something between his belt and his pants, and she pulls it out. And she starts reading, what is this? And he's like, hagitech, this is your get. So, that's okay. Says Gemara, why? Shlafasinami, that still doesn't accomplish the goal. Even if it wasn't on the floor, it wasn't ligidach by gabakarka, but being a manasa biyad, beleka. You need to have that he puts it in her hand. He didn't put it in her hand. She pulled it out from his belt. So how does that fulfill anything? Says Gemara, loy tzricha, no, you needed the orik lechartze. What he did was, he twisted his hips to bring the get closer to her, v'shalafta, and she took it. So therefore, he was doing that with the hula hoop. He's going around like that, and he turns towards her, he moves his hips towards the side, and then she sees his paper sticking out into her face, and she pulls it out. What is this that he's doing? Very passive-aggressive. This guy didn't want to give it to her. It goes like this, and she pulls it out, and says, this is the get. Hagitech, this is your get. Oh, that works, because that was in the scene. You don't do it with your hands. He gave it like this, with his hips. Tanakh, similar in the Brisa. These two cases of our Mishnah. He tells her, here, take this loan document. Or you see it's clearly that shalafte, meaning it's not that she just finds on the floor, she pulls it from behind him. If he reads it, and she reads it, and it's a get, and it gets not a get, until he tells her, hey, this is your get, Divrei Rabbi. Now, he says, a get. Says, no, it's not going to be a get, because since it came to her invalid, it's not going to work. So he doesn't hold like this way Rashi said in the Mishnah, where the Tanakhama is saying that he could tell it to her after she already has it, says hagitech. No, he holds it's not a get that shit. Then he has to take it back from her. The yachzivit nenla, and then he has to go back and give it to her. The yomel hagitech, and tell her, here, this is your get, and then give it to her, and then it's going to be valid as a get. But again, you see clearly that it has to be a mice in the sina, and again, therefore, it's not that it's on the ground; it's that he moved his hips back to her, and she found it behind him. Now, the son of Biyada, continuing with the other cases of the Mishnah, continues the Brisa. The son of Biyada, if he put it in her hand, and she's sleeping. Nera, she wakes up. What is this? She reads it, but Gita, and it's her get. Dear Shirley, and one of these Dear John letters, and he left, he's out already, and she wakes up with the paper on the bed. Ain't a get, it's not a get. The Rebbe says, no, it's not going to be good. You have to come back and tell her, here, this is your get. Again, like we said, he holds, no, it's not going to work. He has to take it back from her. You have to go back and give it to her. He has to tell her, this is your get. Says, isn't this the same case? You already told me hagitech. What's the point of saying another case of the sleeping case? It's necessary. Why? If we only had the first case, that's a Rebbe would say that's going to be kosher from the basi grushehi. Because the first case, when he said, let's say this is a shtar choiv, or she pulled it from between his belt, where she's awake. The only thing that's missing is him to say, hey gitich. So therefore, when he subsequently says it, even after he gave it, that's okay, because the Kabbalah was appropriate, because she was a person that could be divorced at that moment. But if he puts it in her hands while she's sleeping, the la basi grushehi, she's not a person that could be divorced. Why can't she be divorced? Because she's sleeping. And she's not considered as if she's alive, as if she's awake. So I would say, maybe he agrees to B'Shem Allah that you can't subsequently say Hagitach because the mice in the scene was not valid. Had we said the case of when she's sleeping, maybe that's only where the other one, B'Shem Allah says, not going to be a get. But regarding the first case of when she pulls it from his belt, I would say that it agrees to Rabbi that, okay, that is a good mice in the scene, and it's a good Kabbalah. And therefore, you could subsequently say, Hagitich. To say both cases, they say that no, they both disagree in both these cases. Now, related discussion regarding someone sleeping and giving of the get. So Amar Rava, he says, Kasav la get. If he writes her a get, v'nasnoi biyad avda, and he puts it into her servant's hand, Yashan umisham rasei. The slave is sleeping, and she's watching over him. Then Hari's a get, then it's going to be valid as a get, because, as Rashi explains, this is what's called Chatzer HaMishtameres L'daita. It's her courtyard, which is what her ebed is. It's an extension of her property that's being protected with her consciousness. Because since the ebed is sleeping, the only one that's protecting him is the woman owner. Oh, but if the slave is awake, Eina get, it's not going to be a get. Because the slave is protecting himself and what's in his hand. That's a courtyard that's been protected not with her consciousness, because it's the slave's consciousness that's protecting it. That's not considered as valid for the halacha of chatzah, to be divorced. So it says the Gemara, Yashin Mishamrasa is a get. Why does it help her be sleeping and she's protecting? That's going to be a get, because you tell me that's a chatzah mishtameres l'daita. That's considered an extension of her. But amai, you have a different problem. Chatzah malechasi. This is even if you're going to say the slave is a courtyard, and it's considered biyada because it's only biyada because it's her, like a person's hand, they protecting it. So when the slave is sleeping, she's protecting him, and therefore it's mechatza b'shtumas l'daita. But the problem is, since he's a walking, talking courtyard, the chatza malachis lekana. Rava himself, who says this halacha of kasab get benas biyad abdi yashma shamasa, it's going to be get. He himself says in Shnei Meichsin Betalis, in the famous Gemara in the Baba Metzia, He's the one who says that a moving quarter doesn't acquire. So how could he say when you put into the Yada Evet, even though he's sleeping, that it's going to work, but he's a Chatzim Malachas? If you're going to say, wait a second, that's not difficult. When a guy is sleeping is different because then he's not walking at that time. But Rava also says over there that if, let's say, someone's going on a boat and the fish jumped into the boat, he says, if it's something that had been moving, you would not be kaina because it's a chatzam malachas. Then even if it's stopping and it's sitting, it's also not going to acquire because it could. It's felt in the etzim. It's lacking in the characteristic of the entity, where since it could move, it's not considered as a valid chatzar. So if that's the case, this evidence, even though he's sleeping, since he could move, it's still a chatzam malachas. So how are you going to be kaina by him putting the get into the hand of the Eved, even though he's sleeping and she's watching over him? Says Gemara, the halacha is because we're talking about kafes. We're talking about where he's bound up, he's chained up, where he cannot walk. That's where Rava says is going to be a get because it's einero. It's not fit, not something that could be. He can't because he's tied up. So even though you say if you take off the chains, then he would be able to. That we don't say. So right now he couldn't, and therefore that's the case where it'd be a get. If he's sleeping, chained up, and it's her Eved, and she's watching over him, that's where the halacha is going to be, that the husband could put the get into her Eved's hand. I continue the halacha of the opening theme of this perik of Hazayrik. So continuing with this idea about the husband throwing a get to his wife. They were standing in the mall, v'zorkula, and he throws it to her. So it depends. If it gets closer to her, which we must explain what does that mean. Megresha, she's divorced. Kariv loy, in the Megresha. It's closer to him, not going to be divorced. Mechza al mechza, if it's in the middle between them. Megresha vein Megresha, then she is divorced, she's not divorced. It's not clear. In the Kedushin, same thing would work regarding Kedushin, that they're in the mall and he buys a ring and they come out and he throws it to her. Same idea. It's closer to her, married, engaged. Closer to him, not engaged. 50-50, we're not sure. Something goes regarding a debt, which is, if let's say his creditor, the lender, says to the borrower, throw me what you owe me in the street. So let's say they're in passing cars, and he's on the highway, and he says, throw me the money. The zorkala, and he throws it to him, and it gets lost. So what's the halacha? So, karev lamalva zacha malva. If it was closer to the lender, so the lender was Zeichen, he already married it, and therefore the borrower is exempt from the money because I threw it to you. But if it was closer to the borrower is going to be obligated. If it was literally, it was in the middle, then they have to split it 50-50. Let's say he threw him the $500 that he owed him, and it gets run over by some motorcycle, and it's in the middle. So then, okay, 250 for this loss of the money. Now the Gemara asks, okay, Hechi Dami Karev Law. What does it mean when you're telling me that it's closer to her, that then it is going to be a get? Hechi Dami Karev Law, it's considered closer to him. So Amar Rav, he says, Arba Amashallah, if it's in her Dalat Amas, Zer Karev Law, that means closer to her. Arba Amashallah, in his Dalat Amas, Zer Karev Law, that means closer to him. Mean to say that there isn't between him and the get but Dalat Amas, which the Gemara in Bava Metzia tells us, Dalat Amas of a person acquires him. It's considered an extension of your area. So that's what we mean to say, Karev La, Karev La. That says Gemara, okay, so what does it mean in the middle? So Amar Rabbi Shloimy Bar Yitzchak says, we're talking about where both of them were standing in Dalat Amas of the get, one on one side, one on the other side, where the whole get is placed in his Dalat Amas, and it's also in her Dalat Amas. So since it's not only in his or hers, that's considered like in the middle because it's both of our Dalat Amas. So in the way it's by me still, in the way it's by you. That's what it means mechza mechza. Says why don't we see who came first over there to that place? If he came first, so he's zeicher the whole Dalat Amas. If she came first, so she's zeicher the whole Dalat Amas that's near her. So he can't come now with his Dalat Amas and take over her Dalat Amas. You know, it's like the kids with the shadows. You know, whose shadow is like trying to walk on the shadow? My shadow's here first. You can't come now with your shadow, take over my. I already have this Dalat Amas. So now if he's coming, so let's just see who came here first. Whoever's here first, it was their Dalat Amas already. So what are you saying that that's the case of Mechza Mechza? Says the Mabachitim, if you're going to say Dasa Tavai Bahadi Adadi, they got there at the same time. They come on Lombardi time. They come exactly 15 minutes early. They're there exactly at the time, and they both came at the same time. But you can't be so precise that you didn't get there a moment before the other person. We don't know exactly with precision. So why are you saying that it would be having the halacha of megureshes ve'in megureshes? Salam Rav Kani says a different interpretation. He says, what we're talking about over here of mechsa means we're talking about exactly an area of 8 amas, which both of them were standing in a square of 8 amas, not more, not less, that's between them. And there's a Gitin Daf Beis. And now the get was going out from his dalet amas to her dalet amas, where some of it was in her dalet amas, some of it was in hers, his and hers. So like their dalet amas, the border of their dalet amas were touching each other, and then he threw it, and it lands in the middle, halfway on his border, halfway on her border. Says the Gemara, wait a second, if that's the case of mechza, but then you have the following problem. Then she's still connected to him because it's still a little bit in his rishus. Now we know the halacha is v'nasan b'yada required. It has to be totally put into her possession. But if it's half in his, half in hers, it didn't yet leave his dalet amas. That's not valid. That shouldn't be considered a mechza of megureshes. It's totally not divorced. Says the Gemara, Ella Rabbi Rav Yisrael Tavai. They both say that actually over here what we're talking about is b'shtei kiti eid maskinim. We're talking about where there's 2 groups of witnesses. You know what the suffix is? You know what the mechza is? It's when one pair of witnesses say it's closer to him, and one says it's closer to her. In such a case, that is the suffix, and that's the case that we're talking about that we're going to say megureshes and megureshes. Now, another interpretation in the Mishnah of what does it mean karev la? We had one interpretation that it meant from Rav that it means if it's in his dalet amas or her dalet amas. Now another interpretation of says karev la shaninu. No, not dalet amas. We said if it's closer to her, even if it's 100 amas, as long as it's closer to her. V'karev la shaninu, we say closer to him. Even if it's 100 amas, it doesn't have to be dalet amas. If let's say you're thousands of amas away from each other, you send it with a drone, and whatever it's going to be, whoever it's closer to. So then, what's the case of then in the middle? Rabbi says, to me, it was explained from Rabbi Yechanan that if he could protect it, and she cannot protect it, that means closer to him. Like we said, what does it mean close? It's not close, it's just more to him than to her. Yeah, it depends who could protect it. If she could protect it and he cannot protect it, it means closer to her. If they both could protect it, or they both cannot protect it, it's in the middle, meaning we both can't or that we both could. That's the case of contribution. Huh? Right, so this is what he's saying. Right. Yeah, it seems like Tais has discussed this also regarding if this is like regarding Rosh Hashanah, regarding if you could say like it's a simta on the Tzidi Rosh Hashanah. Right, if this would be considered, how is she acquiring it, with what halacha is it being considered as if it's giving it to her? Yeah, it's a good shaila. Right, what is it that he's giving to her? What? So the Yochel Ishtamer makes a what? That makes it is. How's it her rishus? So Taisa asked this question. Taisa says that what I mean, we said b'shus ram like taking arba amas. V'achatanan ha'isay med b'shus ram karvela megureshes just to close the megureshes. Yeshem t'hasam be'en yochai l'shamrei. V'achah b'chai l'shamrei. Taisa makes it sound like that just the fact that you can protect it is itself going to make it yours. Yeah, what is that kinyan? What is that? That is an interesting kinyan. 100 amas away because she can protect it. Right. Yeah. This is yeah, but it sounds like some type of a dominion of Rishus. So the Gemara says, Amru Rabbanan Kamed Rabbi Yechanan. The rabbis said in front of Rabbi Yechanan this interpretation of the Mishnah that he just said. They said in Mishmei to Rabbi Yonis and Hachi. They said in Rabbi Yechanan also like this, meaning like Rabbi Yechanan had explained that it's Toma B'Yechanan L'Shamrai, that we're talking about who is it considered karev. It depends on how much you could protect it. Because Rabbi Yonis was from Babel, but then he made Aliyah. I guess appropriate to say my brother's making Aliyah today to Eretz Yisrael, so I guess it comes up here in the Daf. I hope Na'asach Hatzlucha, right? But also Rabbi Yonis went up from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, and Omar he said, oh, so Rabbi Yechanan Yodin Chavrin Babeloi Lafrushi Kaitam. He says, oh, our fellow Babylonians, they know how to explain that same reason. In other words, Git Gezuk Pshat, because Rabbi Yechanan himself said the same Pshat of Yechain L'Shamrei, that would be the qualification of Karev Loi or Karev La. So in the Braisa that when the Mishnah talks about closeness, it means being able to guard it. Because the Braisa says, Rabbi Lezaim, it says, Koshu Karev La Miloi, whatever is closer to her than to him, which now it sounds like that even though it's closer to, more than him, a dog came along and took it, she's not going to be divorced. And the question was why? Why is it in Megareshes? But the moment it gets closer to her, she gets divorced. So why do we care if subsequently a dog took it? You think you think she has to continue to watch it for the rest of her life? She has to go to protect it? Why is it problematic? And rather must be what the Bryce is saying is that even though even though it's closer to her than to him, but if there's, let's say, a river that's separating, or some type of a mound between her and the get, where if a dog will come along and take it, so it's closer to her, but he could protect it. She cannot protect it because it's a river in our way. So he's not going to be divorced because, exactly like Rabbi Yechanan, because not dependent on just closeness, it's dependent on the ability to protect it and guard it. And even though it's closer to her, but there's a river in the way, and if a dog is coming to take it, she can't stop the dog because the river is there, but he could. Therefore, that's what we're saying. Amalei Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda. Shmuel said Rabbi Yehuda, Shinin, a sharp one. It's so that, what's considered when the Mishnah says Karev La, that's close to her, it means that she could bend down and take it. But even so, Va'at loy tabet uvda, you should not do and paskin and such a story to permit her to get married until the get actually comes to her hand. Why? Because Rashi says there's a gzeira that people might say when it's far that it's close. When it comes to these types of subjective things, was it close to her? Was she be able to guard her? We don't really know. So he basically said, he says, really the halacha is going to be as long as she could bend down and take it. But even that you shouldn't do. It should be until it literally goes to her hand. Up until then, you shouldn't treat her as divorced. So Amalei Rav Mordechai Rav Ashi says, actually was such a story that happened that they threw a get that was close to her and the husband died. But chalitza, and still they required chalitza, meaning even though she was really divorced, and should not require even chalitza. They required chalitza for this reason, because since it didn't go to her hand, therefore they made this gezer that you should be machmer and treat it as if it was not done, because of the concern that then it becomes very subjective to say, oh, it's really close and whatever this and that. So to avoid that, we said that no, we're not going to consider it as a get until it actually gets to our hand. Now the Mishnah said, "V'chein lein kedushin." Same thing is regarding kedushin, the same halacha of the Mishnah. So I remember asking Rabbi Yechanan, he says, "Legitin amru." He says this halacha of our Mishnah was said specifically regarding the halacha of Gitin, that because it's close to her, she's going to be divorced. But v'lo davar acher, not for something else. So, for example, let's say he throws to his creditor his debt, and it was closer to him, and it gets lost. That's not going to apply, because by get where he could force her to be divorced, so therefore the moment it gets closer, it's going to be a get. But in general, just throwing it closer to the creditor is not going to work. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? He says, read our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, "V'chein lein kedushin." It's not just for Gitin. Gitin, you're saying because you could force her to be divorced. It's not true. Kedushin, which you cannot force, and still we say if it's closer to her, she's going to be engaged. Says Gemara, yeah, but Shani Hasan, there it's different, because the Chsiv, it says in the Pasuk, in the Pasuk it talks about that the woman's going to leave his house when she gets divorced. She's going to go and she's going to get married to another person. So the pasuk compares divorce to engagement to tell you, yeah, just like divorce, which you could force, and therefore it's going to work when it's Karav law. Same thing regarding Kedushin. But regarding other areas of Allah, it's not going to work. So the Gemara says, Eitzer, what do you mean? Read the Mishnah. The next thing the Mishnah said, Mishnah says something regarding a debt. Let's say the creditor says, hey, throw me the check. And he throws it to him. If it gets closer to the lender, the borrower wins, meaning that he's not obligated anymore. But if it's closer to the borrower is going to be liable because it's still closer to him. If it was 50-50 and the check gets lost or whatever, then they divide the loss. But one thing you see that it's not only halacha regarding Gitin. You see it is l'davar acher. It is even for chayv. No, it doesn't work for other things. What are we talking about in the halacha of our Mishnah? Is the amalei where he tells him, and that's what the Mishnah was saying, Zadik li chayvi v'tifter. Throw me what you owe me, and then you'll be off the hook. Well, he's letting him off the hook. But if he just says, throw me what you owe me, so he means to say, throw it and then guard it till it gets to me. But just throwing and getting closer to the lender would not be valid. So Gemara says, if that's the case of our Mishnah, where he says v'tifter, so I remember, what do you need to tell me? Of course, he said, throw it to me and you'll be off the hook. So it's necessary. The Amalei, he said, Zarik li chayvi b'treis Gitin. He didn't really say, throw it to me and you're off the hook. He said, throw me what you owe me in the halachic parameters similar to the case of Gitin. So the Gemara says, still what do you have to say? That's the same thing like saying tifter, because that's the halacha baget. When it's kariv law, it's going to be that you gave it already. So the Gemara, no, what would you say? He could tell him, which is a Talmudic terminology of like, I was just fooling around with you. When I said like a get, it's not a get. I didn't say you're going to be off the hook. And therefore maybe he would not be off the hook. Much more, you have to say that, no, if you said, Zagli chayvi b'toyes Gitin, yeah, if it gets closer to the lender, and then let's say the $100 blows away, so I'm sorry, you told me to do it like Teres Gitin, and Teres Gitin is, it's closer to the recipient, it's like I gave it to you already, and I'm off the hook. Also, continue on this halacha of a nasan b'yada. So we said that you have to give it to her, and it has to be a total giving. So Rav Chizdi says, get b'yada. If let's say the get is in her hand, because he gave it to her, but a meshicha, there's a string of the get that's tied to, that's b'yadai, in his hand. So if he could pull it on that little string and he would be able to bring it to him, like these little pranks you do, you give it to someone, you pull it away, then she's not going to be divorced. But if not, if let's say that string is flimsy and he would want to pull it with like those stuff that you buy from the dollar store, and suddenly the string rips the first time you pull it, then Mugaresh, she will be divorced. My time, what's the reason for this? Because Be'inan Krisis Veleka has to have Bechasabla save a Krisis B'Nasim B'Yada. What he has to give her is a book of severance. If he could still pull it back, then it's not a total severance. Amar Yehuda says, Yada Asuya Kiketafres. If her hand was made like a slope, like a pipe, where the fingertips are tilting towards the ground, where she's not stretching out her hands straight up the way people usually stretch out their hands, like hands up like this to receive. No, her hands are actually down like a gutter. V'zarkula, and he throws it to her. Even though the get reaches her hand, in the Megaresh, she's not going to be divorced. It's not like v'nasan b'yada, because it wasn't her hand that was receiving it. So he must say, wait a second, even when it falls, so okay, it's not in her hand, because her hand was not stretched up, it was stretched down. But it's still in her dalet amis. So who cares if her hand is not fit to receive it when it's stretched out? The fact that it's in her dalet amis should itself be enough to divorce her. Says it didn't land on the ground. Rather, when it fell from her hand, it got burnt, and therefore, since what she received in her hand was not a Kabbalah, that's why she's not going to be divorced. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? Even if it doesn't land on the ground, what's the problem? The moment it reaches within her dalet amis, she should be divorced from the airspace of the dalet amis. From the fact that you're saying she's not divorced, and the airspace is not going to be enough, tif should be Rabbi Lazar. So that should resolve the question of Rabbi Lazar. Because Rabbi Lazar has the question, this that they said a person dalat amas acquire for them, yeshlen aver or ein lav aver. Do we give the halacha of that your airspace would be considered as your dalat amas or not? Tif shedein lam aver, we should prove that it doesn't have the airspace because the fact that it fell into the fire and got burned, but it was still in the airspace of the person dalat amas, that itself should divorce them. Says Gemara, no, it's not a raya. Why? What are we talking about here? By medas al gav nahar. We're talking about she's standing on the edge of the river. From the beginning, it was going to go to ruin, because, like Rashi explains, aver she'ina ro lanuach loikani. Meaning this, that we say that the airspace of a dalamis would acquire is only if it's fit to land on there is ground to have airspace for. But when you don't have airspace because she's on the edge of the river, she's leaning over, and what you're giving to her dalaramis is actually river dalaramis. River dalaramis won't have aver of dalaramis. When you're on the ground and it falls into the fire, in the previous case, that could be that it would have the halacha of the dalaramis. So you can't prove necessarily the halacha question of Rabbi Lazar regarding if dalaramis has aver or not, because what we're talking about over here is where she didn't have the aver of dalaramis. But if you did, maybe it would have the kinyan, even if it didn't. Her hands were facing downwards and it didn't even land on the ground. Thank you to Anytime for hosting us.